Hi, I'm Dr. Scott Stripling. I want to welcome you to the museum exhibit at the University of Pikeville. We've been working on this and looking forward to it for some time, and I had the privilege of overseeing the excavation of these particular objects as well as many of the ones that you're seeing at the museum today. In front of me are a couple of important stoneware objects, and I'd like to say just a few words about the stoneware industry in the first century. It actually began about 150 BC when there was a wave of ritual purity that swept through late Second Temple period Judaism. People began to interpret Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 15 differently, that if your pottery becomes ritually impure, you must break it, says the Lord. So, since the Bible said nothing about your stoneware becoming ritually impure, they began to use limestone vessels. And this is part of a whole wave of ritual purity that included things like daily baptism in the mikvah. It included things like using their oil lamps differently, and the type of diet that they used changed a bit at this time as well. The vessels before us were made out of solid limestone, Jerusalem limestone. And we'll remember that the first miracle of Jesus was turning water into wine, but John's gospel is very specific. It says that they were stone jars that they were using. That's that first century ritual purity culture. Now, these vessels came out of an olive press cave at Khirbet el-Maqatir. Our site is about 4.5 acres in size during the Second Temple period, what we would call first century BC and first century AD. And maybe a dozen or so houses at that time with a population of a few hundred people. We believe this was Ephraim of John 11:54, where Jesus spent the last month or so of his life prior to the triumphal entry. Now, the stoneware basin is quite unique. We found it in 21 pieces underneath maybe 5 meters of rubble inside an olive press cave. And we were able to do a complete reconstruction on it. And on the inside, there's actually staining from the olives. There are handles on both sides where it could be picked up. In fact, I'll pick it up so you can see there. And it weighs about 35 pounds. And it's one solid piece of limestone. It has chisel marks on the outside that are very visible, that you'll be able to note. And the beautiful reconstruction was done by my staff conservator, Orna Cohen. And Orna is probably the most famous conservator in the world. You may have heard of the Galilee boat or the Jesus boat, and that's Orna's work as well. And here's another piece of her handiwork here before us. This particular basin type does not have a parallel. There's not an exact parallel to it. So I don't know if the maker was freelancing, but it's similar to other types from that time period, but we don't have an exact parallel. It would have been used for things like food preparation or for washing and so forth. And when again we think about the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, since that was an issue of ritual purity, maybe it was in a stoneware basin just like this, and in fact maybe that's what this was used for. The cups are quite impressive. We call these measuring cups, and this first one is on loan from the Horn Museum. And you can see that it's partially completed. It's not poured out completely on the inside. It's still very rough on the outside, and it doesn't yet have the holes for the handles. These are called measuring cups, and they're very typical of what would have been used for people maintaining ritual purity at the time of Jesus in the New Testament. The factory where a lot of these vessels were made between our area, which is 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself, is a place called Khirbet, and so it's at the halfway point, so maybe 4 miles or so from Khirbet el-Maqatir, and there the actual factory has been found where these vessels were being produced. So not only do we have the vessels, but we have the factory, and you can still see many broken vessels lying around, hundreds of cores from the insides of these cups there as well. Now, had they finished this particular cup, it would have looked like this. And this comes from Khirbet el-Maqatir, and it was found very close to this basin. And you can see the nice finish on it. And this is what would have been used, particularly at an occasion like Passover, let's say, when Jesus is celebrating this last meal with his followers, this communal, covenantal meal. And then they pass a cup around, a common cup, This is that type of cup that would have been used at the Last Supper. And so through archaeology, we're now beginning to understand even things like the Last Supper better. So you can see how it would pass very, very easily. It was also found in several pieces, and we did a complete reconstruction on it as well. I want to say one final word about how these were found. As I said, it was in an olive press cave, and in December 2013 and December 2014, my team excavated these items. Found in among this were about 60 coins, mainly from the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, an enormous amount of pottery from the same time period. We were able to do carbon dating as well from the remains that were there, and it came back mid-1st century. So the typology on the cups, on the pottery, the coins, and the carbon dating all point to a very precise 1st century date for these items. So we're able to triangulate the data. Among these vessels were 8 human skeletons that we recovered. 7 females and 1 young pre-adolescent male. My theory all along had been that in the Great Revolt of 66 AD, what we call the First Jewish War, that our site had revolted against the Romans. And of the 1,300 coins that have been excavated at our site, they cut off in the year 69 AD. Unless they're from a later Byzantine or Islamic period. But it's clear that that's when the city is destroyed. So my theory had been that the men perished up top, resisting the Romans. Women and children were hidden in caves and so forth. Sure enough, we found evidence of hiding systems within these caves, and here we had women and a boy. So apparently men had hidden their families in these caves. The men perished up top, and apparently these women were discovered because among their remains we found evidence of trauma. We found Roman arrowheads, tacks that were unique to Roman military boots. So it's quite moving to, as we excavated this, to realize how these people died, and that when their bodies fell, they fell on top of these objects, and there they sat for 2,000 years until we excavated them. And now they've come to the University of Pikeville, and they illuminate the background of the biblical text, and I hope that they're meaningful to you. They're certainly very meaningful to me as I excavated them.